Hi everyone, welcome to another video by the Orchid Shelf here in Naples, southern Italy. It's springtime now and I wanted to present you one of my favorite flowers in my collection. This is the Rhynchovola Jimminey Cricket, a hybrid between Brassavola nodosa and Rhycholaelia digbyana. Actually, both of the orchids are quite similar to each other. They both grow in the area around the peninsula of Yucatan in Mexico, so in the Caribbean, in Mesoamerica, and the northern tip of South America. Brassavola nodosa grows at sea level up to an altitude of 500 meters, whereas actually Rhycholaelia digbyana grows up to an elevation of 1,000 meters. But looking up the temperatures there, I realized that year-round you have warm to hot temperatures. So the lowest temperature you might actually find in winter are around 20 degrees, which is 67 Fahrenheit. So 20 degrees Celsius, I wanted to say, and 67 degrees Fahrenheit. Whereas at the highest, you have around 32 degrees Celsius, which I believe is around 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's still quite a warm or even hot-growing orchid, which already tells you about the temperature requirements that I'm going to get into later. Before talking about the culture details, I wanted to point out a couple of things about this orchid's shape. So yeah, this orchid grows sympodially, which means that it's part of those Cattleya type orchids which produces pseudobulbs along a rhizome. You have to consider the fact that on a tree, basically the plant would be growing like this, and the rhizome can either grow, actually the rhizome can grow into all sides. But with my plants, it tends to grow into two directions, as long as it has, those grow points. And from that rhizome, the pseudobulb emerges, and then at the end of the fairly short pseudobulb, you actually have these very sturdy, extremely hard, and very thick, fleshy leaves, which are actually really almost like succulents to me. And that not only tells you about the fact that the plant might have to do with occasional dryness in its original location, but also with high amounts of sunlight or like light intensity. Yeah, it's an extremely vigorous grower, and my orchid started out around quarter of its size, but within 2 years it just became this quite big plant. It's actually one of the biggest plants in my collection. These dangling bits are actually, wired holders that I made for this plant, because when these pseudobulbs grow on the sides, it can get quite straggly if you don't have light coming from above. Yeah, what else is there to say about the growth shape? So usually this plant has only one leaf on each pseudobulb. Actually, this must be just a rule, I think. This is not one of my hybrids that occasionally has 2 leaves on a pseudobulb. So yeah, let's say there is only 1 leaf per pseudobulb. And at the end of the growth period, if you take care of it well, these pseudobulbs will grow a sheath within which a bud will develop. And I've had in the past specimens of this Jimminey Cricket hybrid, which had 2 flowers per pseudobulb, and not just 1 pseudobulb flowering, but up to 2 or 3 pseudobulbs at the same time, depending on when they mature and how they mature. So for example, this pseudobulb is almost mature, and you might see a tiny little nubbin inside, and this is where a bud would develop at the maturity of this pseudobulb. Yeah, but for some inexplicable reason, with this plant, I've had a bit of trouble blooming it, so it was surprising enough when actually I managed to bloom it this early spring, and throughout the winter the pseudobulb was developing, and I didn't really think that during the winter temperature levels would suffice for this plant to actually think about blooming, but it's been gifting me this incredible flower for the last, let's say, 2 weeks or so, and in my experience these flowers last up to a month. In the beginning the greenish color will be more intense, whereas after a while it just fades into more and more of a yellow shade. But what I love about the flower is basically that it's so white on its huge lip, which is frilly on the sides, and which has this this inside of the lip which gets deeper green as you look inside, and it's quite mesmerizing actually. As we know of many orchids with naturally white flowers, this orchid is fragrant at night, and in the wild, because color at night is not really useful for an orchid to attract pollinators, what it does is that these night blooming orchids with white flowers very often develop a very, very strong fragrance. And this hybrid between Brassavola nodosa and Rhycholaelia digbyana is absolutely no exception. It is one of my favorite orchids in my collection precisely because of its fragrance. Many other orchid growers on YouTube have pointed out the amazing fragrance of this orchid. At present I just have one flower on this orchid, but it does fill half of a room, and my room is quite big actually over here, with this wonderful citrusy lily of the valley-ish scent that I just can't get enough of. And I don't even have to get that close to the flower. I think then it would be way too intense. So I can just smell the flower from half a foot away, and it's really, really overpowering, but really in a good way. And I just love watching the flower all the time, and especially at night when it's really, really fragrant. And as soon as the light goes on and it becomes daytime, the flower won't be fragrant anymore, and the whole cycle starts again at night. Yeah, so the flower is definitely a reason to keep it. But yeah, so temperatures, as I mentioned, it's a warm to hot growing orchid. So the lowest temperatures that this orchid gets used to in my care are maybe 18 degrees Celsius. So in online descriptions, the areas where it grows to, this orchid grows in temperatures at 19 degrees Celsius, 20 degrees Celsius, which is 67 Fahrenheit, up to a temperature of 32 degrees Celsius, around 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So always very, very warm. And I heard from other growers it is actually this warmth that is really important for the plant to thrive and to bloom. So if it grows too cold all year round, then it might actually not bloom. But I grew this plant, and it was actually another plant, another clone, let's say, of this plant in the UK, and for me the key was the light. So as these long, thin and very fleshy, thick leaves suggests, this plant thrives on extremely high light. So I would even say higher than regular Cattleyas. So Rhycholaelias and Brassavolas really need higher light than even Cattleyas, maybe even than Vandas actually. So here in Naples, I just grow them outside on the balcony. And of course, they might get some sunburn in the beginning if I'm not careful enough, if I don't let them acclimatize to the sunny weather on the balcony first for around 1 or 2 months, where I have them behind a 50% shade cloth. But still, even then, I would say the sunburn is not too bad. I mean, of course, you shouldn't expose a plant immediately to sunburn, but this plant is really tough and loves high levels of light, which is why then for the rest of the summer, once it got acclimatized on the climate outside on the balcony, it just stays in a balcony, in one of those balcony boxes in full sunshine. So starting from 1 o'clock, between 1 and 2 o'clock in the afternoon in summer, I just have sunshine blasting onto my balcony until sunset, and the plant loves it, and usually it blooms throughout the summer. And in fact, I doubted that under my artificial lights this plant would be able to bloom, even though this combination of 2 Barina T8 lights and a store-bought 1-strip red spectrum LED light I assumed that it would not be enough, but I'm very grateful that at least one bud made it through, because in my care it's actually quite common for the pseudobulbs not to develop any buds, or to blast its buds once the pseudobulb is mature. So that's very common in my care when I keep this plant under artificial light. And I noticed that once I keep this plant on the balcony, it actually grows much, much more reliably. So I'm guessing it's a combination of really high light and high temperatures that this plant loves to be put in and to grow in, actually. Now, when we talk about high temperatures and high light, there are 2 things very important to consider. So even though these fleshy leaves suggest that the plant might be able to survive drier months and drier periods, where it maybe rains only once every couple of weeks or so, I do not recommend this at home care, and I've never had problems with blooming or growth if if I didn't keep it that way at home. So what I've been doing is, since I kept it in the UK, when I had the other clone, I just keep it constantly moist and constantly damp. So on orchidspecies.com, I read that the author even went to Yucatan, the peninsula in Mexico, and saw how one of the parent plants, Brassavola nodosa, grew right on the roots of mangroves, where occasionally there would be, you would have splashes of ocean water against the plant. So right at sea level, you can imagine that it's just constantly wet and damp, and the plant seemed to be growing fine. And that's precisely the experience that I made. It rains quite a lot in Naples, and it rains a lot, of course, in the UK, where I kept this plant outside in the summer. And this plant loves to stay moist all the time. So, for example, let's talk a bit about the potting mix. This plant is in desperate need again of being repotted. One sign is that now the pseudobulbs have reached the edge of the pot and the roots are growing over the edge of the pot. I just keep repotting it every year because it just grows so fast and takes up so much space. And it just grows really profusely, maybe keeping it a bit drier once pseudobulbs reach maturity might help induce flowering, but I've never really done it because it just keeps flowering on its own. Not as much as the other clone that I used to have, but still. But I think in my care, what I've been noticing is that, to have constantly growing roots with these beautiful fresh root tips, this plant needs moisture and dampness. So all of these roots which have been growing outside the pot, either I broke them off or actually they stopped growing because there is not enough moisture. So this one you see it just dried off. Whereas all the roots in the pots are thriving because it's constantly damp. I have a mixture of bark, ceramis and perlite inside. So this mixture actually creates a lot of dampness in the substrate, which some greenhouse growers might actually say that it's, almost like a death sentence for the plant, that it gets too moist, that the plant should actually dry out in between waterings. But in regular home care, I noticed that the plant would rather prefer not to dry out fully. So maybe if you really want to make sure and you're worried about rot issues, let the plant dry out until maybe here, the bottom quarter of the pot, and then just water it again. Of course, in this larger pot setup, it would take around 2 to 3 weeks for this plant to dry out completely. But what is actually important when we talk about drying out orchids and providing moisture is that you shouldn't provide too much moisture, not because of the moisture per se, but because the fear is that you will suffocate the roots by means of creating anaerobic conditions for bad bacteria to grow and the orchid to decay because the roots are not getting oxygen anymore. But if you provide fresh water consistently and continuously, that substrate will get washed out, instead of just filling it up all the time. What I'm talking about is if you flush it regularly underneath a tap and give the pot fresh water, freshly oxygenated water, then the plant will enjoy that as well. So I wouldn't be too worried actually about moisture so much, rather than the danger of leaving the plant in stale water, which really is dangerous in my opinion. I put some sphagnum moss on top because I thought that would help root the plant. I think I'm going to take it away because it's quite old and full of limescale. I've got very limescaly water here in Naples. And this sphagnum moss has been decomposing, so I'm just going to take it away, and that for sure will help aerate the substrate a bit more. In the beginning I had it there because in this way I can lock in a bit of moisture and it helps for the roots to grow into it. It's been good for the plant. I really have to repot it. It's been becoming a bit of a monster in my collection. Of course, it can grow so much bigger and you can just keep adding pot sizes. And of course, I'm sure that a specimen size of this plant would be really, really beautiful, but I just don't really have the space. So what I would probably do is, let's look at the growth point. So we've got one growth point here, and if I keep it well enough, then I might get 1 or 2 pseudobulbs growing on each side again afterwards. Then I've got a second growth point, and then a third one. I think this is a 5th growth point. This one should be a 6th growth point. So you see we're getting into all directions, and this should also be another one. So I can feel, no, I can't feel any bumpiness. This is definitely a 7th one, I think. I've lost count at this point a bit. But you see we have a new pseudobulb growing here from the growth node. Yeah, so what you can do is, as long as you leave around 4 or 5 pseudobulbs on each segment, you can also think about cutting the rhizome and dividing the plant, repotting it into separate pots to create multiple copies of the same plant. And this is an easy and very successful way of propagating the plant and kind of tidying up the growth pattern a bit, because then you will begin again with one growth direction, and then if you're lucky enough, the plant will start growing in a Y growth direction to the left and right again, and then the whole multiplication starts. For now, I'll just keep it the way it is. I have to either up pot it into a bigger pot simply, or let me just see what I'll do. But for now, I'll just enjoy the blooms. Yeah, keep it moist, keep it under highlights. Of course, as always, I recommend having a fan run near your plants to have constant air movement. Of course, on the balcony outside during summer, the plant will get a lot of that stuff for free. Air movement, high temperatures, sunlight, and then it will grow profusely and bloom profusely for you. In my experience, this plant is really, really easy to grow. As fertilizer, I give it a MSU well water fertilizer, but in my experience, any other fertilizer is as good as long as its formula is for orchids. And I flush it regularly, and that just makes the plant grow and grow and grow and grow, and I'm sure it won't disappoint you. Let me know if you feel that I missed out on something, or if you want to know more about this gorgeous plant. And otherwise, let's enjoy its bloom once again. And I can't wait for it to show me its fragrance again tonight. Yeah, so this was Rhynchovola Jimminey Cricket for you. And thanks for tuning in. Subscribe if you liked this video. Thumbs up, of course. And see you the next time. All right, have a good day. Bye-bye.